Okay, thanks for coming back to my show. I appreciate it very much. Today we have, this is going to be played as probably a bigger segment, but today I'm interviewing Professor Michael Schudson. He is let me just give you a little. He's on screen with me right now. First of all, welcome, Professor. Appreciate you coming on.
Pleasure.
I want to give people a little bit about who we're talking to here. He has a BA from Swarthmore College. He got his master's and PhD in sociology from Harvard. He taught at the University of Chicago in the late 70s, taught at the University of California, San Diego, UCSD from 81 to 2009. And by the way, I was attending the University of San Diego during that time, so I guarantee you we didn't cross paths, but we were in the same town. He has taught at the Columbia Journalism School, which is present for about the last 10, 11 years. And saw this in your bio, sir. You have been awarded various honors, including the MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship. That's got to be not something easy to get. And the Guggenheim Fellowship and honorary doctorates from the university in the Netherlands and in Hong Kong. And I want to mention again, but you have recently written a book called Journalism, Why It Matters. And if you want to talk about that, we can. So you certainly have the background. You certainly have been in this world a long time. I personally reached out to you because I got interested in what's happening with journalism today. I presented a premise to you in my email, and it basically said that it seems to me it's all commentary today, and we've lost journalism. And you came back with that you disagree, that you don't necessarily agree with that premise. So this is really what I'd like to talk about. I feel like we're into commentary everywhere, from Fox News to CNN. We have a lot of clicks needing to happen out there. All the news organizations, at least newspapers, are trying to survive. It seems like TV news is working a little bit better. But you need people to have eyeballs on you. You need to have people click. You need to have drama. So it seems like we've gotten into commentary and away from journalism. And maybe there is good journalism. And when you have something called Fox News, maybe it should be called Fox Commentary or CNN Commentary and not news. I've always associated news with, I don't know, I grew up thinking, you have three sources, and probably that famous TV show with who were the guys that broke the Watergate scandal,
Woodward and Bernstein.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a movie about them. So I think that was my growing up thinking this is the kind of journalism that we've got to have these sources and you can't go to publish without it. So I've taken up some time already. So, sir, what are your thoughts on anything I've said so far?
Okay. Well, I think there are two pieces of this. Yes, there is more commentary than there used to be in the 50s and 60s and into the beginning of the 70s. A former student of mine and I did some research looking at three papers as examples: the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Milwaukee Journal, and looking at the front page and whether the news stories were full of just the facts, ma'am, or had some degree of interpretation, analysis, and or commentary. And the results were quite striking to me in that into the mid-60s, 90% or so, 90 to 95% across those three newspapers were just the facts, within some kind of a framework, but you could not figure out by reading the stories whether this newspaper or this reporter was a Democrat or Republican or something else. It was a strong effort to be what we call objective. Then things began to change, but in an interesting way, and this is where perhaps you and I disagree. There got to be more analysis. There was a critique developing in the 60s and in the 70s that just the facts privileged some people over others, and in particular, government officials over almost anybody else. And the government officials might.
Privileged meaning, can you explain what that might mean?
Yeah. That mostly you heard the voices in the
Oh, right.
stories of government officials. If there was an opposition to them, well, a certain opposition was acceptable. That is, government officials of the other party in our two-party system. But others who were maybe critical of both the parties didn't get much of a voice. So that was standard on the one hand. On the other hand, if you quote a Democrat, you quote a Republican journalism. And that was the model, and it was adhered to in a paper that was papers that were quite liberal, papers that were rather conservative. That was the model. Then there got to be what I call a move toward contextual journalism. And the idea was that just the facts doesn't communicate very well to people who aren't already part of the political system in a strong way. And
kind of grooved in. They're not grooved in.
That's right. That's right. So a little bit of background, how this differs from what happened yesterday. If it's just the past 24 hours facts, it doesn't give most readers enough of a clue about what this news really means. So, but how then does just to finish so by the 1990s, the Just the Facts, Ma'am story was about 50% of the front page. And the contextual journalism was the other 50%. This study went up through about the early 2000s. I don't know how different it is today. I don't think it's very different, maybe a little more contextual journalism. And again, where I think we might differ is, I think the move toward more contextual journalism is progress. I think, and it doesn't mean that it's commentary. It's, that is, it's not necessarily partisan commentary. It's mostly not partisan commentary in the mainstream media. It's an effort to go behind the news, to give a context, to give some analysis of what this thing that happened yesterday or in the last few hours might mean to the public. And there is, in fact, much more of that than there used to be. This is something of a problem for journalism because, yes, does that allow for more opinion? It does.
Right.
It does.
The background, filling in the background with what the journalist thinks is important for the person to hear to understand the story could generally lead towards their maybe bent one way or the other.
That's
potentially.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So that you know, from my perspective on journalism, I'm not someone who longs for the past of journalism. It wasn't, in my view, that great. It was there's a lot of talk these days about news deserts mostly in small towns where papers have failed.
Right.
And I have to say, when I moved from California to New York and drove cross country, 2009, I picked up local papers at whatever town I stopped for lunch in or stopped for a hotel at night. And these were community newspapers. They provided some value, that is, they got local people's names in the paper. That's what they were supposed to do. That's what sold newspapers. Yep. The same thing was true in the British press with the local press. That's fine. That's perfectly good at serving needs of a building community in a community. But is it kind of high-minded journalism? Is it investigation? Is it putting the news about what the political structure looks like in your community? No, I mean, the story I found in an Ohio newspaper, nothing against Ohio, but um, it was in the middle of the summer. There was they took most of a page interviewing local citizens about their opinions about ice cream. Now, it turned out most people in this town liked ice cream, but they got their photo in the paper, um,
Sure.
and okay, it was fun. You got to see a picture of a friend in the newspaper. That's kind of cool, but it's not Woodward and Bernstein.
Well, certainly, and I think that also pushes us to the point of news has to be viable economically, obviously, to work in the world. So now we have to make sure that the news has interest locally, and of course, that story, people have put their picture in the paper, and maybe they all love that ice. Who knows what was in the story? But that's the local thing, and everybody wants to read about it. So in that regard, I suppose they're trying to stay afloat. But that just pushes me over to, and I think both. You have the network that Ted Turner set up. We have CNN on what I consider to be leaning left, and the Fox News, which I think everyone in the world thinks leads right. And it seems to me that we just need to talk about this, especially in the broadcast news. This is a lot of commentary. I honestly don't know where you start when you look at any of those two networks on what actually is the news portion of it and what is, and you have to do this. And this is what I think is confusing because it's Fox News and it's cable news network, that not every show on there is going to be news. It's going to be a lot of commentary, a lot of opinion. Well, let me get on the guy that I know is going to say what about what, and I'm going to get him on here, and we got to have a lot of viewers. And of course, Roger Ailes brought up Fox News on a certain bent, and they're making billions of dollars. CNN is doing their thing, competing. So this is, unfortunately, this is what I've been around the country during the 2016 election doing my own thing with a book I had, and I've seen the division in our country. I know they have I guess, a purpose in the world, but I can't call them journalism. Can you, Professor? I mean, is this journalism what's happening at either of these networks? You're the expert, so let's everybody just
Okay.
pause while he thinks about this, because this is going across the world right here. I'm telling you, it really frustrates me.
Yes.
Either way, sorry, I'm breaking into you again. Either way, I got to tell everybody, I'm not a left or a right. I don't care. I just think that we are pushing the public, and everybody globs onto their two sides. So again, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
We have a complicated story here, and I talked so far about newspapers, and I think that's important to do in part because that's where the economic crisis is, as you suggested, and so that's where um, conventional news is most under threat. Um, However, most people still get their news not directly from newspapers, but from television, not online either. It's still television.
Okay.
More people say in surveys that they get their news from television than from any other source. Now, the cable news is a portion of that. The broadcast news, ABC, NBC, CBS, still has larger audiences for their evening news than does CNN, or at that evening hour. They're doing it all day, but CNN or Fox, we sometimes forget that. And there's interesting studies that the main effect of cable news, of cable, is to turn people away from news altogether. There's so many other options that if you like sports, you can watch it all day long. If you're interested in home shopping, you can watch it all day long. Yeah. And so there's a kind of news avoidance that has come along with cable. But the degree to which Fox primarily and explicitly, despite their motto about fair and balanced, that they're neither fair nor balanced, and they know that. CNN has a more conventional approach to the news as such. But I agree with you that I find them very hard to watch because so much of it is people yelling at each other. And you know that I don't find that very instructive.
No. Okay, fair enough. So we're into the cable world. We know, really, some of the programs could be talk shows. They could be. There's so many different formats, and I talk to my listeners a lot about be discerning on what the news is. Just because it says it's news doesn't mean, quote unquote, it's news. We have this term that has gotten morphed into other things that you have to evaluate whether or not the information you're getting is someone's opinion or is it based on research and good facts. All right, so fair enough. Let me just, I don't always have a professor of journalism from Columbia sitting across from me on the screen, so I've got to ask you a couple other questions because this comes up everywhere. The liberal media, it definitely is pushed out there. It's been most of my life I've always heard the media is liberal. What's your thoughts? No, and also I got to qualify this. We're talking to a professor of journalism, so I don't know where you land in the spectrum, but I'm interested in your thoughts. Just if you can be very discerning on what you can stand back and look at this whole field. Is it liberal? Is it not?
Okay, so I'm not ashamed to say I do have political views, and they are liberal, um, and and so you can factor that into whatever I'm telling you. Um, are the mainstream media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and such, are they liberal? Yes and no, which is the answer given by one of the at the New York Times, one of their own public editors or ombudsman some years back says socially, he says, let's not get around it. We're, most of the people on the staff are, say, in terms of abortion, they're pro-choice. Are they Democrats? That's a little harder to be sure about. And is the news that they write, does it favor Democrats over Republicans? No, not necessarily. Are they willing to investigate Democrats and throw them out of office if necessary, or if that's where their facts take them? Yes, and the New York Times has done it a number of times, including with the Democratic governor of New York, whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, but he had to leave office thanks to New York Times reporting. There are multiple cases of that, including, by the way, that it was the New York Times that broke the story about Hillary Clinton's private server that the Republicans, made a mint on, maybe won the White House on. So that's part of what a professional journalist does. You follow this story, you don't follow your preferences. And in that respect, I think it's something, it's obviously an attack, but it's something of a slur on professional journalists who do, in my judgment, really try to follow the story, not to push their agenda. Now, what the ombudsman said is that on social matters, say this newspaper should be open to covering and should be covering minorities. It should be covering the gay rights movement. It should be covering things that hadn't been covered by most newspapers for most of history. And in terms of diversity and inclusiveness, if that's a liberal value, well, then yes, the New York Times is liberal. in terms of being willing to criticize people of the liberal party, Democrats, they're more than willing to do it. If they have a story, they'll go with it. I don't think that's true of Fox News.
Fair enough. So part of the push has to be, if you have a good story that's going to get a lot of readers, it also goes back to the economics of the situation. You certainly don't want to ignore a popular story because, of course, that brings readers, that brings viewers. But, and I read the New York Times and I read the Wall Street Journal almost every day. And I have to say, on political issues in the New York Times, to me, standing back, it's very, very liberal. They're very against anything going on with Republicans, and it's just on the political side. Now, deeper stories, different kind of stories around the world. I find that the journalism at the New York Times is great. They've done a lot of good stories. So not that we're going to agree necessarily here, but the overall premise of the liberal media, it does not, you think that's a wrong tag?
I think it's really an oversimplification. I think when I look at, it's not that journalism doesn't embody some values. And one, I was looking at some statements from a journalist, one from a sociologist back in the 1970s. Even at that point, they said, yes, there are certain unspoken and maybe even unconscious values that journalists in the mainstream media hold, like a two-party system is better than a not two-party system. So someone like Bernie Sanders has, his supporters have claimed, and I think probably correctly, that he didn't get a fair shake from the liberal media because he called himself a socialist. That's outside the bounds of, the sociologists talked about moderatism as a value in the news. I think that's right. Both of them, the journalist Jack Newfield and the sociologist Herb Gans, both said capitalism is a value in the news. Capitalism, not socialism, anti-socialism. Capitalism with a human face, maybe not unbroken and unridden profit, but capitalism with some allowances for public welfare. Is that liberal? Well, not by, say, European standards. That's what counts as liberal in the US. Europeans would think of that as conservative.
Yes, I suppose where on the spectrum it potentially is relative.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so fair enough. Next question, fake news. I mean, of course, Donald Trump has brought this forth since he's been president. I know that it has put the journalism profession under heat. Fake news, is there fake news? Is that just a dodge from him, or is there some fake news out there?
There is some fake news out there. I can say with some assurance that no one at the New York Times or the Washington Post intentionally offers fake news. Do they make mistakes sometimes? Of course they do. On the other hand, there is fake news, and it's circulating mostly online, and that makes this something of a new ballgame. In that there are rampant conspiracy theories all over the place that have no support, and yet they're so easily available. And if they sort of suit a person's pre-existing viewpoint, they may give them some credit. And unfortunately, that this is not true of Republicans in general. but it is true of Donald Trump. Uh, I have no idea how he comes up with the particular set of beliefs that he does, but they're not often, they're not supported. They're in violation of everything that, in terms of the coronavirus, the science presents, his own scientists present, um, and they tend to sometimes um, presume that there's a terrible conspiracy out there to get him. There's a lot of opposition to him, sure. That's life in a democracy. But is it based on fake news? I don't think so. It's just news he doesn't happen to find supportive.
Fair enough. So mainstream news versus mainstream news has come up quite a lot, and you've even mentioned it yourself, the term mainstream news.
Yeah.
So, you're from your world, you're the professor journalism. Is there valid, what is mainstream news and what isn't? And is there valid non-mainstream news?
Yes. What is mainstream news? I think it's news that holds high a set of professional values. They begin with this notion of objectivity. Give us the facts, and give us, if they're in a two-party system, give us the facts as seen by the Democrats, give us the facts as seen by the Republicans. If you can adjudicate them, do so. If you say, well, but the Democrats are just wrong about X, or the Republicans are just wrong about Y, and here's how we, the independent journalists, have come up with that conclusion. And so that's different from either advocates of a particular political viewpoint who choose stories and choose facts that accord with their viewpoint. And there's all kinds of advocacy journalism. That is, advocates of a particular political position who comment on the news. And people choose the version that they want to read. So if traditionally in the 50s, 60s, 70s to today, conservatives would read the National Review, knowing it's advocacy journalism, but thoughtful, reasoned, from a given standpoint. Liberals would read The Nation or The New Republic. Nonpartisan, no, starting out from a liberal position. Is that legitimate? Yes, that as long as you're open and above board about it. But those are all commentary and advocacy oriented news outlets. The significance of the objectivity oriented newspaper and its newspapers, even today in 2020, that provides something like 60-70% of all the news people get. It's picked up by television, it's picked up online. Original reporting comes from newspapers, and that in the mainstream media is adherent to what, this is my language, not everybody's in the journalism world, that adheres to some combination of objectivity 1.0, just the facts, 1950s, 1960s, and objectivity 2.0, which is set in a context, which absolutely, as you suggested from the beginning here, requires an additional layer in which opinion can enter in, does enter in, but it's still oriented to this professional value of, we're telling you to the best of our ability what the facts are and what they mean.
And do you think that's happening more now than in the past? I mean, let's take the stream over the last 100 years of journalists that have walked along the footpaths of America and written words and then eventually on TV. Do you feel that, because we have to trust, this is a trust. We have to trust that the information that we're getting and we're reading is ideally true. I mean, that's true and hopefully not too slanted. Do you feel that those journalists, because now we're placing our trust in that journalist that we're reading, better today, the same, worse? I mean, what is your feel along this road the last 100 years of where we're at?
I think it's better, and that doesn't mean we trust it more. I do think it's better. At least according to the polls, we trust it less. Republicans in particular trust it much less, and that's not a good situation. Journalists themselves recognize this as a serious problem for the future of journalism. But I think that has more to do with the polarization of the political world than it does with journalism as such. Journalism has changed slowly, and we're still absorbing this change that I talk about as Objectivity 2.0 that began in roughly the 1970. So that journalists have not resolved the problems that come about when you do try to give context for the facts as such. In Columbia Journalism School, I think of this as a kind of contradiction that has to be worked out on a daily basis in every story, which is what is journalism at heart about? Professional mainstream journalism, it's reporting a story. But that's complicated to say reporting a story. Reporting means going out and getting the information, getting the facts, writing them down, making sure it's valid, making sure there's a second source. What's the story? The story is, well, it's a kind of instinct that reporters develop, like there's a story here. And can you encapsulate it in what they call a nut graph? Just a couple of sentences, something you could say quickly before the elevator door closes. That requires some interpretation. That requires some analysis. And it's the storiness of the reporting that attracts an audience and reaches an audience. You can publish a lot of statistics on X, Y, or Z. Who's going to read it? You want to know what it means. That's part of the job of the reporter.
Well, and that brings in drama. I mean, it's all story also when we go to the movies and TV. And I'm not saying that we have to make sure it's fiction, but even in nonfiction, you need to make it interesting. And this is another complaint I have, but maybe this is built into what journalism is. I don't regularly see the good news on the journalism in the newspapers, and it's the bad news. It's the dramatic news. It's the crisis. It's the, oh my gosh, did you see what he did? You know? So, and again, I think we go back to selling. It has to sell. It has to grab. It has to be of interest to others. My one thing I constantly say is you rarely hear, hey, Julie and Bob have been married for 10 years. They're very happy and thank you very much. Versus, well, Julie and Bob got in a fight and they're, so it's the drama that we love drama. That's why Netflix and Amazon Prime and everybody in Disney is big. We love drama. So is that built into journalism? I mean, come on, this has got it. You're the teacher. You have to come with drama to the reader, not something that is too vanilla. I mean, you tell me. I've never been in a class.
No, that's absolutely right. There's a nice study about Pulitzer Prize winning stories. Do they try to tug at the heartstrings? Yes, much more than than an ordinary story does.
Sure.
They reach some emotionally compelling, and they try to, and a journalism teacher wants you to
Right.
locate that. And I just twist this a little bit from the way you put it.
Okay.
Does that help sell papers? Yes, it does. It helps, which I think is nearer to the reporter's heart. It helps to communicate something important about the world. That's what Shakespeare did that too in drama. If it was boring, people are going to walk out in the middle of the play.
Sure. No, it's fair enough. I counsel also my readers at times when things get a little bit too much, they watch too much news, take a break for a week, take a break for 5 days. Yeah, you're going to feel better. That's the thing that also frustrates me. Because there's the news out there can be pretty rough. And yeah, I get that it is something to be reported on, but it can get rough.
Let me just give you one quote I happen to have handy here from Baudelaire on the French press, 1860 something. He says, from the first line to the last, the press is nothing but a tissue of horrors, an orgy of universal atrocity. And it is with this loathsome appetizer that civilized man daily washes down his morning meal. Yeah, there's some truth
Thomas
in that.
Jefferson. I think we have some other American figures that have a few things to say about the press too, but we won't go there. That's not really what I'm trying to do, but go ahead.
Right.
Anything more you want to say on that? I mean, the washing down, as he said, I mean, it can be rough.
I think you're right. In the coronavirus era, it's certainly the case. I mean, do we have heroes in the fight against the virus? Indeed, we do.
Sure.
And is the press attending to them to some extent? They're certainly trying to. I mean, they're looking for the different stories and trying to remind people about the different ways in which this thing, the pandemic that affects to some degree all of us, affects us differently depending on where we sit in the, and that's part of the effort that the mainstream media and others too are trying to get at the moment. And is it depressing? Yes, it is.
Yeah, I've recently had to take my own back up a little bit. It just got a bit too much for me. So I come and go with it sometimes, depending on what's going on. We're almost done. I've actually run over your time. One question, and then I'd like you to just do anything you want to say in closing, but it seems like the news. I go to the Wall Street Journal, I go to the New York Times, I go to, LA Times, I go to these different, and I know a lot of them are owned by the same organization. But let's say we have ones that aren't. It seems like a lot of the same news stories. And I feel like we're missing, and I know a lot of complaints from people out there is they don't cover this. They don't cover this story. They don't, which is where these alternative media sources have come up. What's your thoughts on that? Do we all does the mainstream just kind of jump in together because that's of what's interest today? And of course, we're still trying to get clicks and readers.
There's some truth in that. Yes. One of the truths is that it takes a fairly big news organization to really be doing and investing in original reporting. So,
sure.
So the small community weekly or even daily doesn't do very much on the whole in terms of original reporting. So the stories do get retailed and picked
syndicated. I mean, it's syndicated across a lot of newspapers. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when I lived in San Diego, I said, well, I didn't need to subscribe to the New York Times because the San Diego Union Tribune it took the New York Times news service, and you could read
Sure.
the New York Times in the San Diego Union.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, there's it. It's hard work to be
Yeah.
a real journalist and to get out there what they not during the pandemic, but is otherwise called shoe leather reporting.
Sure.
You knock on doors, you make those phone calls, you do the interviews that provide the heart of the story.
Fair enough, and I can see that with all the syndication happening. Okay, give you the last word here. I appreciate your time. Obviously the press is very important to our country. It's just stated in the Constitution. First Amendment, freedom of the press. Framers of our country definitely felt it was important that we have this organization, this profession working with freedom to expose and talk and keep everything going, so we don't have cover-ups like happen maybe in communist countries or other things. So it's good. This is all good. It's important. You're the man teaching it. You've been in it for a lot of years. What's your summary? Again, I whatever you'd like to say at this point. Interested in your summary on where we're at, what you think we're doing, and where we go from here.
Okay. One thing to say, speaking from a journalism school that graduates a couple hundred students this week.
No, it's great.
On Zoom. I'm impressed by the drive and desire of these young people to go out there and be reporters. Some of them, I heard a student last year at the end of the year who, from a young woman from Mexico, was planning to go back to Mexico and do political reporting. And people asked, but isn't that dangerous? Yes, it's quite dangerous in Mexico to be a reporter. It's dangerous in other parts of the world too. But it's serving an incredibly valuable purpose when it's done well, when it's done with a sense of vocation, a sense of mission. I'm not a journalist myself. I'm a historian, sociologist, but and I just happen to study journalism as the industry I'm looking at. But being this close at the J School to working journalists and those who want to be working journalists, I have to say, my hat goes off to them. That they do we in journalism schools exaggerate the power and the significance of journalism in a democracy? Yes, I think we do. I don't think it either has as much influence or as much value as we sometimes think it does. There are a lot of other things that matter, like the justice system, like the separation of powers, and so on and so forth. There's a lot more, but it's depressing when the leader of the country thinks of the press as the enemy of the people. I can't think of a president in history who has loved the press. From George Washington on, they were criticism. They had not very much friendly to say to the press. They felt oppressed by the press.
Sure.
But you got to get a thicker skin if you're going to be in politics, and that's part of the press's job is to critically evaluate our nation's leaders.
Well, certainly a tough job. I wouldn't, thinking of the journalists that go out into war-torn areas and whatnot. Let's just put it, sitting in the White House briefing room, it can be pretty rough too. So, I mean, it's not for the light of heart. I don't think journalism is. So, I appreciate you giving us your time. I've really just picked this up because I've had these questions. I appreciate you taking the time to let me ask them to you. And I want to mention again, your book is called Journalism, Why It Matters. You can find it on Amazon. And Professor, thanks for taking the time today.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Well, that was Professor Michael Schudson. Interested. I tell you, my show is mostly about what I get interested in because I see what I see, and then I want to ask some people some questions. That was a professor. I think my next interview on this is I'm going to get a journalist. I'd like to get a journalist who's out there doing it, so we can ask the same questions because it just sometimes seems to me, well, you heard what my questions were. So I appreciate him coming on. It's probably not always easy to come on, have someone start grilling you, and it's going to go up on YouTube and Facebook and everywhere else. Here we are sitting in the midst of what we're sitting in. I really think we need to get the country going. We need to get businesses back to work. We need to get the economy rolling. 30% drop in GDP in this quarter. Are you kidding me? This thing, it cannot continue. We will have not only permanent damage to our economy, we're going to have permanent damage to people. People losing jobs and not coming back, businesses closing, not coming back. This is, we're going to have a pandemic against businesses is what this is. You have a bug coming in and killing people. We have a bug coming in and taking out businesses and people's livelihoods. The government cannot continue to just fund us forever. And not everyone's getting funds. I don't get any funds. So it just isn't, this is not viable, and we need to hurry up and get over it. And we can't wait around until there's some vaccine hanging out. So we have to get going now. We have to do it smart. I want to thank Tracy Andrew Scavage, the producer of the Schomburg Show, for helping find these interviews. Tracy, I got to commend her. She's constantly bringing forth different ideas. What about this? This could be interesting. What about this? You know, this job I'm doing here, talking to you, is a passion of mine. So if I don't feel like it's going to be something I'm interested in, it's potentially, I don't know if you're going to be interested in it. And if you are, but I'm not, I'm probably not going to do a darn good interviewing them. So it's tough. She's got a tough job trying to figure out what the heck is Sean going to be interested in doing interviews on. So I really appreciate all of Tracy's work. She does a great job, and she brings us some great guests. So thank you, Tracy. There we go. That's my words. But during this time, in my opinion, is when we shine. So continue to do that. It's driving me crazy to sit inside my house. I'm based in Los Angeles right now. We're still locked down. And you can see by my hair, it is getting longer and longer, that I have not had a haircut in quite some time. I would say this is definitely the longest my hair's ever been in my life, but I wanted to get it long anyway. So, hey, I got a good excuse to do it. We'll see what happens when my hair dude opens back up. We'll see if I'm going to get it cut or I just let it go. We got to get through this. It's just taken, even though some days I get up and go, it's like Groundhog's Day. But you still got to take care of the people. You still got to be in touch with people, neighbors, and whatnot. So be good out there. Let's get through this, and let's build our country back up, folks. All right. Next time. Bye-bye.